So good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello if you are watching the replay. Welcome to another one of our online webinars, this time all about new Build Watershock, understanding damp problems in new homes. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson, and today joining me, I'm pleased to welcome Tony Isbell, MD of Acres Building Consultants. We are about to start the main presentation. Just for those that are joining us, if you do want to pose a question over the course of the webinar, first place I would point you to is to the chat facility. Now, if you're on a desktop or a laptop, that'll be running down the left and the right-hand side. Just go to that box, type in what you want to say, and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, fire it off to us. If you're on a mobile device, you just need to drag up the screen. You should see the comments box there. You can alternatively send me your question direct via email at andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Or if you want to use our social media tools, just simply go to LinkedIn, Facebook, or X, formerly known as Twitter, and use the native messaging tools just on there, and we should pick up your question. So I can see, Tony, we are bang on 9 o'clock. Great time.
Excellent.
So, I mean, initially, the idea of this webinar came about from a PR release that the PCE did, gosh, must have been a way back in April. And to our surprise, just seemed to take arms and legs through the different media channels. Now, I know when it comes to dampness, generally it always seems to be that we look towards our existing older housing stock, and that typically takes principal focus. But I suppose with the demand for new homes having to be built at speed and both scale, does seem to be an increasing amount of people complaining about dampness, condensation, mould issues in these shiny new homes. I mean, what exactly is going on here? Why are we seeing these problems? And as professionals, and all the professionals joining us this morning, what do we need to consider to determine the root of the problem? And what should we be telling our customers and clients? Some big questions there, Tony. I suppose I'll pass it over to yourself, good sir.
Thank you very much. Morning, everybody. Welcome to the seminar. If I can get the thing to work, hang on. And we've got, there we go. It's working. Perfect. Right. So the idea is that sort of we're talking about new build properties, but in essence, new build properties don't necessarily mean brand new buildings. It can actually be alterations to buildings or refurbishments. So that's the first part. So when we talk about new builds, I always view this as new homes, not physically a new build. So the first one we're looking at here is visible water and dampness. So what is it and when does it happen? Well, it particularly occurs in autumn and winter months, obviously, because that tends to be the normal point when people experience damp and mould or condensation. But as I've said before, you can see that sort of, yes, it does happen in new homes, but we have to be careful to make sure that we remember it can actually also occur in refurbishments, and particularly alterations to office buildings where they're forming new flats. But the point I always like to think of is, if you're a homeowner, or you or I had just gone out and we'd spent the best part of our life savings on a brand new property, the last thing you're going to want to expect is mould, condensation and water. So homeowners, quite rightly, are struggling to understand why this is happening. And this, the example that you see in the photograph there, oops, hang on, that's not what's happening here. That was actually a new build bathroom that happened, and basically the condensation in there was so bad, even with the extractors going, that we ended up with mould and condensation on the actual tiles. But again, would a homeowner typically expect to see that straight away? Probably not. So what's actually happening? So the thing with this is, without a shadow of a doubt, everybody knows there is an urgent need for new homes. There's ever improving standards, which is a good thing because we need to improve standards and we need more homes. But the problem this creates is dwellings are beginning to be built to ever increasingly tight timescales. There's always budget constraints, and with budget constraints to make things affordable, which is quite right, what's the on effect of that? Then we also have to consider moisture created during construction and occupation. For some reason, a lot of the jobs, when we look at them, there's a lot of moisture that's trapped within the building. So let's look at those individually. So dwellings built to tight timelines. Obviously, one of the key issues here is trades follow each other. And this is a particular issue where each trade doesn't have sufficient drying time. That's a quite common thing. So an example of that would be, we've seen skim coats applied to walls and ceilings that haven't fully dried before people have painted them. So the paint has actually peeled off, which is not particularly good. Again, you buy a property, it's the most expensive thing you're ever going to buy. The last thing you want to be seeing is paint peeling off the walls and the ceilings. The other thing that needs to be considered is when you're constructing during wet weather or in the autumn or winter. We've come across a few examples now where, in order to meet the deadlines and to be able to walk on the screeds quicker, calcium sulfate type screeds have been used because they have a quicker curing time, which means that they can be walked on quicker. But the problem is they actually take longer to dry. We actually had an example in a basement we were working on where the calcium sulfate screed actually took 3 weeks to dry to a point where they could lay the floor. Now, if you multiply that over multiple homes, that creates a real problem. And this is where dwellings being built to tight timelines, it's something we'll need to consider. So let's look at the next point. Budget constraints. We need to make sure houses are affordable. If we can't make housing affordable, we're going to create a very strange market. As English people, we tend to love owning our own homes, and that's a good thing, but we need to make sure that it's open to everybody and everybody can afford it. But in order to do that, corners can be cut. Specifications are not followed. Is it a case that sort of somebody says, I've got this extract fan, for argument's sake, it does exactly the same as this extract fan, but one's silent, one's slightly noisier. There's a £30 or £40 difference in each one of those. The specification might be the same and they have the same duty, but one's going to be more quieter than the other one. But you know for a fact that what's going to happen is people invariably, because of the budget constraints, are going to look at buying the cheapest. So a question for everybody here is, as an industry, how can we actually get around this? How do we avoid these kind of issues? Because it's not something that's going to go away, but we need to consider it. So let's look at the last one here, was what's happening. So you look at, there's moisture created during construction, but that is actually increased by occupation. I don't think I know a single person that doesn't have a shower, doesn't cook, and doesn't dry clothes on a radiator or an airer in their house during winter. It's a fact of life. It happens. These all create moisture. But if we've created a situation where there's excess moisture when the property is created, and during the winter months, we're not opening the windows because it's cold, and if we have a ventilation system that's too noisy, people switch it off, and then we shower, we cook, we dry clothes, that creates an excess of moisture. And given the rising fuel costs at the moment, people are tending to either switch off the heating or keep it very low. But again, a question we all have to ask ourselves is, how can this be managed by a homeowner? Again, would a homeowner expect to go into a house and see running water down the side? They might expect it in the kitchen, they might expect it in the shower room, but would they necessarily expect the excess of moisture that's there? So this was quite an interesting one. In a PCA poll that was carried out on a recent webinar, the interesting point here was that 72% of the people in the poll who took part said that less than 30% of installations in new builds, in whichever form that takes, comply with building regs. That's quite astounding when you think about it. So the question really is, how can that be addressed if you've got time pressures that can't be reduced? Is there a lack of enforcement from building regulators such as the NHB or LABC? I don't know. But one thing that was hot off the press last week was the LABC are actually considering extending warranties from 10 to 15 years. Now, if you actually step back from that for a second, that's a 50% increase in the warranty. Does that actually mean that there's going to be more control over follow-on trades? Is there a tighter control over Part F for ventilation? That's quite an issue to consider, especially if the other bodies follow on in their consideration of extending from 10 to 15 years. That's something to bear in mind. So the starting points for investigating potential issues, right? We all know there's likely to be running water. This example that you see here with the mould on the ceiling, this was a new build property. It was, I believe, about 2 to 3 months old. We got asked to go there. It was one lady occupying it. And this formed literally within a month. This was during the winter. So we looked at sort of various things. And yes, there was a high humidity in the air. Great, tick the box for that one. But when I looked at it in a bit more detail, I actually got on my belly and crawled across the ceiling void and found that in that area, there was a lump of insulation for the ceiling missing. Now, would we expect that insulation to be there? It should have been, but then who was controlling that? Who checked it? Is there an issue in that? Who measured the performance of the contractors? Who checked who was doing what? Who signed it off? Because what you see there shouldn't have happened, but it did. But literally, with the case of putting the insulation back into that area and then ventilating, that actually dealt with that particular issue. So let's look at another one, an example that we had. This was another new build. Now, this was a dry line wall, and the property in itself was built during an exceptionally wet winter, and the contractors carried on building because of the tight timescales they were under. Again, it comes back to how can we avoid that? I don't think we can. But what that led to was they were under such pressure to do it, that for the homeowners to move in, that they literally dry lined straight on top of absolutely saturated breeze blocks. So what happened then was that over a period of a couple of months, you started to see what you see in the photograph there. And the end result of that was that the plasterboard was so damaged that we had to actually take the plasterboard away. And if you think, you've bought a brand new property, would you expect somebody to come in and say that your plasterboard is so damaged because of water from when it was constructed that the plasterboard needs to be removed? Probably not. Another one here is, unfortunately, I've only got a picture of, or an example, I should say, sorry, of lifted and warped timber, but we've also seen this on vinyl floors where it bubbles and actually has created or allowed tiled floors to debond and blow. But this instance that you see here, this is a typical example of what we tend to see. But the interesting point here is that when we do our investigations, we typically find that the worst areas for lifted floorboards and warped timbers tends to be under furniture. And then we actually started thinking about that. And it comes back to sort of, if you've got the rest of the room and that's open to the air and the warmth and it dries, but the area underneath the furniture doesn't have that same level of heating, this is why this potentially happens. But we have had other instances where it's actually occurred in the center of the floor in the worst cases. Mouldy carpet, we've only ever come across this twice, so it's, in our experience, it's not that that extensive, but I'd welcome any thoughts from anybody else that's seen this on a regular basis. Again, you know, you buy a brand new property, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see this within a couple of months. You've got a nice new shiny house and you've got mold on the carpet. Where's it coming from? Let's go back to that one. So is that something we would expect a homeowner to have to deal with? The answer's got to be no. So let's look at the last one here, which is peeling paintwork or wallpaper. This was an example on an alteration and refurbishment to an existing flat. And all the walls were stripped and it was absolutely fabulous. And then they came back and then they replastered the walls. But again, because of the tight timelines, they had literally no time to do anything. So within literally a couple of days, they were wallpapering the walls. And so that then led to, within a matter of a week or so, the paper was just peeling off, as you can see in that photograph. Again, if you bought something brand new, would you want to expect, or would you expect to see something like this? The answer's got to be no. So what kind of checks would we typically look to carry out? So find out the history of the property during its construction. That's a good starting point. What type of ventilation system or systems are in place there? And a bit out the box thinking, but environmental condition spot checks. It's not something that everybody does, but we've done it a couple of occasions. So let's look at those individually. So finding out the history of a property during its construction, that's absolutely critical in some instances. Was it left open during a particularly wet winter? Did construction have to stop? Because if construction had to stop, that then creates another time pressure on the developer to get the properties finished in time. Now, we had a new build that we were looking at, and there was white marking that was all over the garage blockwork. All the internal walls were dry lined, but within a matter of months, the paintwork started peeling off of the dry lining. So we started looking into this in a bit more detail, and then we thought, right, let's look at the history of the property. So we started chatting with the owners, and the good thing, or the fortuitous thing, was that they happened to look at the property whilst it was being built. They had an interest in it. And I learned from talking to them that it was built during the wet winter months, but it was so wet that the works had to stop. But the important part they said there was that they never saw anything being covered over. So that's leading on to a question as to sort of, well, hang on, if as an industry we know we have to stop work because it's too wet, what would we do to necessarily protect the construction to try and avoid that as much as we can? It's an interesting concept. So the two questions that for me come out of this is, how do you control that at site level? It's incredibly difficult because it comes back to time and money. If you have tight deadlines, this means that the property will never be left or unlikely to be left to fully dry before it can be occupied. So that's a thing that, as an industry, we need to look at and consider how we can deal with this going forward. The next couple of slides, there's some good examples of stuff that we've come across. Very interesting from my perspective, but in this particular one, there was a localized extraction system, or not, as the case may be. It was in a kitchen in a new build property that was about 1.5 years old. The owner was saying they're cooking away and the steam just wasn't going anywhere. They were getting so much steam, it was ridiculous. And it got to the point where the paint on the ceiling directly above the extractor was actually peeling away. But the point with that was, when we started to look into it in a bit more detail, that extractor is on the ground floor and it's on an external wall. So the question to me would be, well, hang on a minute. If the owner could only cook with the door open because the recirculating extractor system couldn't work or do what it needs to do, is that an acceptable solution for that person with paint peeling off their ceiling, when surely the simple answer would have been to have core drilled a hole in the wall and ducted it to outside? Was this something that was checked? Was this part of the original design? Was it a potential cost cutting? I don't know. But the point to me would have been, if you have an extractor there on an outside wall at ground level, surely you would want to core drill that and put it to outside. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't. So let's look at another one. This is a very interesting one that we noted. This was an extraction system that was fitted to an ensuite, and this was at first floor level. As you can see, the extractor is on one end, and it's on an outside wall. Perfect, brilliant. That's exactly what we want to see. The shower, however, was located at the other end, some 6 meters away. But the interesting part with that was that there was a door to the bedroom between the fan that was extracting to outside and the shower area. So my question would be, how on earth was that extractor ever be expected to, how is that ever going to draw the moist air from the people having the shower out when it's 6 meters away and you've got a door between the two, which means that it's going to extract the air from the door as the closest source? So that then raises a question as, well, who designed that system? And then who signed it off? Okay, this doesn't happen all the time, but it was a good example of when something's going to go wrong, it can go wrong big style. Mechanical ventilation with heat recovery systems, MVHRs. Great systems when they're installed properly, absolutely superb. But what we found is that, sort of quite rightly, some developers will prefer to use contractors' design. Makes perfect sense. The reason they're doing that is to keep the cost down. Why employ a mechanical engineer to design something and then find that the contractor will say, actually, that doesn't work or whatever? So it makes perfect sense. I can see the logic and I can see the thought process there. In a property we were looking at, it was about 3 years old before we got involved, and the owner wasn't living in it. And the reason they weren't living in it was because there was mould within the ducts. So you think to yourself, well, okay, if there's mould in the ducts, how do we know that's actually been installed correctly? Because then, in theory, the mould shouldn't be there. How can we ensure that the contractors have the necessary skills to take that part forward. Now, the reason I'm put that part in here is because on the next slide, this is the part that I found very interesting. And the actual homeowner reached out to the original contractor and was told by the original contractor, there's nothing wrong with this system at all. It's perfectly fine. You're not maintaining it. Okay. So the owner wasn't quite sure what they meant by that. So they went and got a second contractor's opinion. The second contractor's opinion was that, hang on a minute, the supply and extracts had actually been fitted the wrong way around on the extract on the main box. So this homeowner who's got the problem has two different views by two different contractors. Now, they're both saying they were MVHR installers. So which one of these contractors is right? And in these instances, who does the homeowner believe? We actually ended up having to get an expert MVHR engineer in who confirmed that the ducts had been fitted the wrong way around. But if it wasn't for that, how would the homeowner necessarily know? Because they've got two conflicting opinions, both by MVHR people, installers. Environmental condition spot checks. This is a bit outside the box thinking. And we've only done it on a handful of occasions. But for us, this actually helps dramatically because it helps you identify certain issues. So we had an issue on one new build that was about 2 years old, I think it was, when we looked at it. There was a spot of water on the inside face and nobody could work out what it was. So I went along 5:30 in the morning, did some thermal imaging, and basically we found that in that particular area there was a very cold spot. So when we did the investigation works, we took a brick out, we actually saw there was a big hole in the cavity wall insulation. And then what was happening was the water was just transferring across that created this wet patch. Now, again, would you necessarily expect that to happen without doing slightly more out the box thinking as to trying to find what that was? We would never have come across that. Quite a common one we're coming across at the moment, unfortunately, is that radiators, when they're being put in, not in all instances, but on a fair few that we've seen, they're undersized. So if the radiator is undersized for the room, is it producing the right heat capacity, which then leads on to all these other things that we see? But the question for me then is that if the radiators are undersized, why? Is that a design issue? Is it an installation issue? Is it that potentially the slightly smaller radiator was £20 cheaper? You multiply that over 50 or 100 buildings, that's a lot of money to have. Don't know, but that is something that we're seeing. But it does have an effect on the way the property is heated. Is the ventilation system working correctly? Has it been switched off? A lot of times, if you go back to the two fans that have exactly the same duty, one's £30 more than the other because it's silent, the other one's noisy, invariably, as humans, we are going to look at switching something off that's noisy if it's going on all through the night because it stops people from sleeping. I certainly would, and I suspect the majority of yourselves would as well. So is that something we can expect, or should we be thinking slightly more and saying, if it's in a bathroom or something, we should be looking at having a minimum noise level for these kind of fans? So what do we tell customers and clients? Are there any short-term fixes? Well, you know, we have ventilation, we have heating, we have dehumidifiers. But if we go back to an earlier point, if it's cold outside, could you reasonably expect an owner or an occupier to keep their windows open in winter with an increase in heating, fuel price rises. Now, as a homeowner myself, I wouldn't want to sort of jack the heating up and then open all the windows. Yes, I might open the windows slightly, just as a vent type of thing. But how many of you would do that? It'd be interesting to see sort of how many of you would do that kind of thing. And again, if you look at an existing ventilation system, that to me, given everything else that we've talked about so far, the key point here is the ventilation system has to be the answer to this. But the question really is, how does the system be designed and installed to take account of that additional drying load? Is that something that comes back to design? Now, if we wind this back to the LABC potentially looking at extending the warranty from 10 to 15 years, how does that affect what we're talking about here? That can have, if they do that and the other people follow on, that potentially could have a massive change in the focus and the way people think in designing and installing. I suspect everybody here's come across this, where you have an instance of a new build flat. Typically, it's an internal bathroom and it's ventilated using a humidity controlled extractor. Great idea. But in this particular instance, the fan was the extractor was so noisy, it was running constantly as well. And the lady had 3 young children and it was keeping the children awake. So understandably, and I suspect you and I would probably do exactly the same thing, if there was an extractor running all the time, you've got 3 young children, you'd want to switch the thing off to keep the children asleep. But again, is that fair or reasonable to expect an owner of a property to leave an extractor fan whirring away noisily, keeping their children awake? I don't think it is, because I wouldn't necessarily want to have that. Would you? So in my experience, I don't think there's anything such as a short-term fix, because these tend to be more of a sticking plaster solution. For me, yes, people can use dehumidifiers, but we only tend to really use those in worst case scenarios. But again, if we're having to bring a dehumidifier in, would we necessarily expect an owner to bear the cost of either buying it or hiring it and then actually running it, given the fuel prices going up? What do you think? Do you think it's fair and reasonable to expect to have to bring in dehumidifiers to cope with the extra loading? And who pays for this? Invariably, it'll always be the homeowner. So what are the long-term fixes? Well, personally, I actually think better design of ventilation systems. But this then leads on to a number of questions for me as to who's best placed to undertake that design. How can that design be checked and, more importantly, enforced to avoid corners being cut? Because we all know the world we live in, corners are likely to be cut. It's a fact of life. So for me, the answer is a recognised qualification in the design of ventilation. And we use that as a standard to which everybody can follow. But that then leads the question of who leads the way on that and how does that get enforced? So go back to LABC potentially extending from 10 to 15 years. If they go that extra 5 years, that extra 50% on their warranty, is this something that is going to need to be considered? I think it will need to be. Looking at sort of other long-term fixes, again, it comes back to, in an ideal world, we would have better control over construction during construction. So follow-on trades literally aren't on top of each other. And when it's exceptionally wet weather, the right measures are put in place. But we all live in the real world. And for me, I think it's very unlikely, because time and cost constraints are not something that we as an industry are ever going to get away from. But again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So where can a homeowner get practical, qualified and professional advice from? So they can look at the PCA residential ventilation group. That's a brilliant starting point. Mechanical contractors, yeah, perfect. Mechanical engineers, perfect, excellent. All three really good ideas. But when we speak to most homeowners, very few of them have actually ever heard of the PCA. So the question is, if they haven't heard of the PCA, invariably they will go to a contractor. Fine, no problem with that at all. But the question then comes back to, we need to make sure that everybody is on the same playing field. Because without that, we go back to what the previous example, where we had one owner, she had two completely different answers to the same problem, both from people who said they were MVHR contractors. So this is where we need to set the standards and the training, for me. Whilst we can't influence or change time pressures or financial constraints, I think it is important to remember that not everything as an industry is out of our control. If we get the ventilation designed right and it's installed by qualified individuals, that will go a massive way towards resolving the problems. We get things signed off correctly, whether it be building control approved inspectors. Again, making sure that the accountability is there to sign things off. You didn't do the design right. This needs to be changed. Pick it up before the homeowner goes in. But also we need to look at best practice guidance to make things understandable and easy for people who are looking at these kind of things. Because without that, it's going to get lost in the ether. We know that some developers will always prefer contractors' design and others will prefer mechanical engineers' design. It doesn't matter who does the design, but for me, whoever does it needs to have the right qualifications. So an important parting question to you as an industry is, how can we ensure consistency across the board? How can we avoid cost cutting to having an adverse effect on things? These are all important questions. For me, consistency can only really be achieved by ventilation design and is being installed by qualified individuals who have a recognised industry standard qualification. Everything is signed off by qualified authorities who have the power to actually say, it's not right, you need to change it. We improve best practice guidance, but also we should be making sure that homeowners have practical information from day one on the importance of ventilation systems to remove moisture from construction, and they understand how this works. The homeowner is the person that has to live with this problem, not us. So we should, I feel, be giving the homeowner as much advice as possible from day one. So what do you as an industry think? Please let us know. I'd welcome your thoughts and opinions. So additional guidance can be found from approved document F, manufacturer details for drying times, particularly with screeds and things, PCA forums and PCA training for ventilation. If there are any others, please let me know. So a big thank you for everybody. Much appreciated. Thanks for listening.
Oh, Tony, you caught me off the guard there. I wasn't expecting it to be so quick, just right at the very end there. I've not even managed to get my presentation and last wee start bits up, but I have now. But here, many thanks for sharing your knowledge and guidance. I do have to say, though, you did depress me a little bit by mentioning round about your particular area, homeowners not really knowing about the PCA. I think I probably need to work a little bit harder around about your area to get the PCA better known. But moving on from there, we do have questions that have come in, folks. If you do want to pose a question, feel free to do so. All you need to do is just go to the chat facility, stick in what you want to ask, and I'll pass it on to Tony. Tony, I think my first question comes from Chris Goetz. He's asking, when it comes to the construction phase and the checks it needed, should we not be just going route one by employing more clerks of work?
In an ideal world, I would say yes, because I used to actually do clerk of work in many years ago, and it was a great way of doing things. But I think the reality of that is that sort of, unfortunately, that is another cost. And whilst I 100% agree with that, I'm not convinced that that is a cost that people or developers will want to have. They will rely on the likes of the warranty providers to come in and sign things off, and or site supervision by the managers. But yeah, I agree that something along those lines would be fantastic, but unfortunately I can't see it.
Well, do you know, following on from that, and I apologise for the person that's mentioned it into the comments. I saw it as a passing comment, but there was a comment made by someone about the new homes quality code, which is, I've never actually heard of this, and I was just doing a little bit of Googling on it there. But if we're not employing more clerks of work, should construction companies then be more forced on to signing up to this code so proper checks can get done on properties before they get handed over?
Ideally, yes. I mean, it all comes back to the core issues are, if you can't, there's no way you're going to get over time and money constraints. So the only other way you can do that is to try and ensure that the standards to which everybody works to from day one are higher, or they're enforced more.
Right, okay. The problem is, though, with enforcement, if you don't have your clerks of contract and if people are not signing up to the home's quality code, though, what are they signing up to? Is it a case of, there's your keys, homeowner, if you find any problems, then we might be at the end of a phone?
Well, I think in reality, it might end up that sort of we get to a point where, as an industry, we recognise that sort of something else needs to change fundamentally in the way that we do things, and whether this be governments or whatever, but ultimately everybody needs to be thinking of the long-term solution as to how we can deal with this, and not as the government thinking they're doing their part, as an industry we're doing our part. I always believe that people should talk and say, right, this is where we need to be in 10 years' time, regardless of who's in the industry, regardless of who's in power, and then actually set a timeline to ensure that sort of the right thing is done by the right people, but everybody signs up to it to say this is how we want it to go.
I agree. And you know, folks, I'll share out information, just if you're not aware of it, the new Homes Quality Code and the replay email. So if anyone wants to read it, it will be within the link in the email there. Moving on, Rachel Shallon is asking, this refers to looking at the history of a property, but she's asking, how can you find out information about the construction phase of a property? Typically, she finds that's never available.
That is a big problem we come across as well. What we tend to, in extreme cases, we actually ask for the site diaries to see from the developer, you know, the site manager say, right, okay, we know there was a few problems here. Open book, can you please tell us, sort of show us your site diaries, because we just want to understand what's happened. You do meet some resistance, obviously, because that's giving secrets away, but other contractors they're more than happy to do that, because ultimately everybody just wants a happy homeowner. So if by them passing information across, it gives us information as to how we can deal with things. But it is very difficult to try and get that information. Fortunately, probably 40% of the people that we work with, they all take a vested interest in their houses. So they're looking at them all the time to see what's happening. But we know that doesn't always happen, unfortunately. But it is very, very difficult to try and get that information. I agree, yeah.
I think by the sound of things, Rachel, I think Tony struggles as much as yourself on that one. If anything, actually, it almost sounds like almost as part of the new homes quality code, and this could be something that's already part of the new homes quality code. There needs to be almost a history of what's happened within the bill, almost like an MOT for a car. As it's kind of building up. So it means that if someone like yourself or many of the other professionals on this call need to go and visit that property, at least they have the background history that they can take a little look at it. But actually, on that note, during the build, I've just seen a comment just pop up from John Goble. He's referring to best practices to try and stop properties being saturated during the construction process. I mean, what is it, in your opinion, that construction professionals should be doing during the construction process to stop this saturation, to minimise the amount of moisture that's getting absorbed within the timber, within the building structure and fabric itself?
Well, again, it comes back to sort of, if you're doing the development in the winter and you know it's going to be raining, because most people look at the forecasts and know when they can do certain trades. But invariably what tends to happen is that sort of, regardless of that, your time pressures say that you have to do things in a certain manner. But when I was training years ago, we used to actually have one of the guys that did the brickwork, and that, he always said to me, at the end of the day, he would always cover the brickwork over. Yeah, and that seems like a really stupid, simple thing to do. But in winter, and we know it's raining, that could make a big difference. Yeah, and it's things like that that sort of working with the individual tradespeople to understand what it is that they're doing. And even if you go back to NHBC standards, for argument's sake, they've got certain things in there that tell you how to store materials in wet weather, how to protect things in wet weather. And maybe it's that sort of we need to be looking at, or that type of thing that we need to be looking at as well.
Well, you know, Mario has just posed a comment just on the chat there, to a certain degree, almost setting the cat amongst the pigeons. I'm going to frame it a little bit differently, Mario, than how you put it onto the chat. But, I mean, how responsible would you say the like new build construction industry is when they're actually knocking up those buildings? By the sound of things from the webinar, you're saying there needs to be a greater level of responsibility. But is it a case of it's now just a rush for the money, or is there simple route one things that they could be doing that they're just not doing?
I think there's a number of factors involved with this, and the core one is that everybody wants things done so quickly because there's such a massive pressure on building things quickly that there just aren't enough homes. There's a massive home shortage, and to try and get that resolved, people are going to do things quickly. But that then comes back to sort of, okay, so if you're going to do things quickly, how can we ensure that sort of those issues don't occur? So does that then come back to making sure that standards are in place and who enforces those? You then have the problem of sort of potentially, do people cut corners on, like for argument's sake, the two different types of fan or a radiator being undersized? It's an interesting concept as to how that is going to be managed. And I think the only way it's going to happen is the industry as a whole has to admit that there's a problem and actually work out how to do it, because individual groups trying to push things forward is great, but until the industry as a whole understands and gets on board with that, then we're almost fighting a lost cause to a degree.
Yeah. It almost sounds to me that, and someone mentioned it within the chat, and I can't quite remember, but I'm almost nodding my head to what they said though. But it almost sounds like you really need to get everyone into a room, you know, and just really knock it on the head, you know, just really get these best practices, drawn out and getting everyone agreed to it. But, you know, David Brindle's actually just mentioned something, and I think it comes off the back of, you know, the looking at the saturation of timbers and timbers within the new build. He's suggesting, rather than using timber frames, is it an idea that we should be looking towards light steel frames?
Strangely enough, we've actually seen a lot of those in the last 6 months going up. A lot more steel framed buildings, because as David quite rightly says, they're a heck of a lot quicker, and you don't have that problem of the moisture being absorbed by the timber. So that could very well be an answer to get the speed there. But then it's a case of, do the people putting that up, or have the people putting those systems up, got the required skill sets? And I know it might sound a bit silly saying, well, it's only a steel frame structure type of thing. But to me, I think that sort of whichever trade you want to put in place, the people undertaking that need to be trained. You know, we've seen examples of cross-laminated timber schools being built with millimetre tolerances. And when they're installed, the people putting it together don't know how to put it together. So they're at it with a chainsaw. And you just think, but this is ridiculous. It's millimetre tolerances on something like that. But, you know, if you apply that in a simplistic format, back to what they were saying with steel frame buildings, the principle that makes absolute perfect sense. But are we going to make sure that the people doing that have the right skill sets?
Do you know, it's almost like when you're talking about the millimeters, it's almost like taking a hammer drill to your teeth. Rather than using actual proper dentist equipment, do you know, you just wouldn't do it. Do you know that it's? I don't know how that analogy jumped into my head, but maybe it's with a dentist pending coming up soon for me. But interesting. But David actually made another comment as well, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, it actually he's referring to the building regs, and should building regs for new builds be drawn in the requirement for space for tumble dryers to prevent clothes from drying on radiators, racks, and thus kind of helping to minimise the amount of moisture that's building up in the property?
Again, all that in reality makes absolute perfect sense if there's a mechanism of getting that into there. But again, I think this comes back to how, as an industry, we can influence and alter those standards to make sure that sort of these things are taken into account. But then the other part of me that says, whilst that's a good idea, how many people are potentially going to be able to afford at this moment in time to actually run those? Yeah, if you maybe wind back 5 or 10 years, most people were using tumble dryers without thinking it. But at the moment, are people going to do that? Are they going to run a tumble dryer when it costs money? But the thought process and the principle, that absolutely sound, because if you're giving somebody an opportunity to have a tumble dryer where they might not have had one before, they might well use it. And again, that could actually resolve part of the problem.
Well, you know, Tony, I don't mean to kind of go back on a question here, but you know, there's a couple of comments that have just come in about the steel frames over kind of timber frames that, you know, I just want to kind of draw on to hear your thoughts on. Firstly, Tony, my comments are jumping. Firstly, Tony, I'm struggling to pronounce your surname, so I'm not going to even try. But he's mentioning that mortgage companies don't seem to like light gauge steel buildings. But further on to that as well, Jason Walker is mentioning that steel frames don't combat the moisture problems. Inherently, building materials stored on site are going to get wet and dry. Kind of understand that, Jason, and we get that. And I suppose that maybe goes on to about the need for kind of protection. But just on the kind of comments about the mortgage companies liking or not liking steel frames, and also about Jason mentioning about the need that steel frames not commenting the moisture problems. What are your thoughts on these two things?
Well, mortgage companies, we were actually working with a developer 6 months ago, and they were one of the thought process we actually said was to do a steel frame building because it was cheaper, and the developer actually came back and said the mortgage company won't touch it, not going to go anywhere near it with a barge pole. But I couldn't quite understand why, because if it's done correctly, there's no problem with it. Again, is that something that we need to maybe look at as an industry and try and help and advise the mortgage industry to say to them, actually, here's the proof that there is nothing really wrong with those particular points. You know, there's nothing wrong with a steel frame building if it's done correctly. And here are the standards that it should meet. So kind of, I do understand, because we've actually come across this ourselves where mortgage companies just won't go anywhere near it on a development. But it's a case of maybe we need to educate the mortgage companies, because there's a risk associated with it, and people will always be risk averse. So it's a case of how we can show them that there isn't a risk with it by proving that if things are followed in this standard, then they're fine. And sorry, I completely forgot the second point because I got carried away on that one for some reason.
No, that's all right. No, that was very interesting, actually, just on the mortgage company kind of side of things, because it's now starting to make me think about the comment you made about LABC and them increasing their warranties to 10 to 15 years. And you were quite rightly mentioning, and I didn't think about it at the time, that's a 50% increase. That is massive. But I mean, it's part of the reason that they're doing that is because of these problems, is to take or start to draw down the risk on mortgage, the risk that mortgage companies may be kind of considering within these new bills with the moisture problems kind of drawn in. And is it a case of, is it just LABC, or is it actually a government thing? Is this something that, Tony, in your opinion, you could see being drawn out by everyone, all the kind of warranty companies?
I mean, ideally, if this was government-led, and again, this comes back to my point where it's irrelevant which government's in power, they should all have the same thing that says, joined up thinking we need to deal with this as a country, this is how we're going to do it, and then follow it through no matter who's in power. That would be probably a more influential way of making something happen than trying to have, for argument's sake, and I'll just put that, if LABC said, right, we're just going to do it, and then nobody else follows, you know, it's kind of, again, if you think of how much extra would that 5-year warranty be, for argument's sake, as opposed to the 10.
Well, do you know, oh, sorry, Tony, just interesting, just because you just mentioned about kind of being led by government. I had two comments that just came in mentioning that it is government-led rather than just being LABC-led. That, to me, actually brings a little bit of joy, I think. And I think if it is actually government-led, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, and I don't really know much about it, but if that is the case, do you know, why isn't everyone else not jumping on board on this? Is it just a case that this has just been newly rolled out?
Quite possibly. I mean, it's a difficult one to sort of understand. I mean, there's a reluctance to kind of follow this through as an industry, or is it that sort of maybe certain people are actually trying to lead this and force a change by saying, right, yeah, we'll do it to start with, for argument's sake, working in line with government bodies, for argument, and take it forward to actually try and influence and change the way that the system and the market works.
Well, folks, if anyone else has kind of answers on this kind of question, then we are keen to know. We don't pretend to know all the answers, so feel free to share on the chat and certainly tell us more. I'm going to ask one last question, Tony, just before we kind of wrap up. This is actually a more specific kind of technical question. I know Michael Horton's still on the call, but Michael's asking that over the past month, he's been to 2 new build properties suffering condensation and mould to the floor screed over the block and beam on the floor. This has caused the carpets to become damp and, of course, suffer from mould problems, etc. He's asking, have you seen this problem before and what your recommendations are?
Where we've seen that was where the calcium-rich screeds were used, and that was to try and get the quicker drying times. But as I said, with that particular type of screed, yes, you can walk on it earlier, but they take a lot longer to actually dry out. So there's always that pressure of, yes, I can walk on it, which means other trades can follow on, and then we can construct and carry on from that perspective. But that doesn't take an allowance for how long that particular screed will need to dry out. And I suspect there's probably other types of screed that I've not come across yet that could very well have the same sort of issues. And maybe that's something that we need to look into to say, okay, if we are putting floor things down, what types of screeds, and have like almost a practical guide for people to say, okay, in winter, these kind of screeds can be used, or these screeds can be used whenever, but during these times, you have to make sure that that particular type of screed, you allow a week, that one you allow 2 weeks, that one allows 3 weeks, so that it's making people informed as to sort of what the product manufacturer is actually saying, because invariably, and again, I'm open to other people's comments, but my experience and other people's experience I've known is that sort of, if someone said to you, right, you can get in there and you can crack on with your screed and you can walk on it within a day, or you have to wait 3 days, they're not going to care what type of screed it is. If they can walk on it within a day, they'll do it without looking at what the repercussions may be.
Well, here, folks, sadly, we have to kind of move on from kind of questions. There is a couple of questions I know of that I haven't been able to ask Tony. What I will do, however, though, is that I will look at the questions that we didn't manage to answer. And if Tony can, I'll pass them over to Tony. If Tony can, he will hopefully maybe get back to you with an answer. Now, for those that are looking for additional information, you heard Tony allude to some sources earlier on in his presentation. If you are looking for additional info and guidance on dampness, well, there is several resources that I can point you over to, completely free for you. Starting off with our professional pages, literally just go onto the website, hit the professional section, guidance, and there's a stack load of dampness related content in there. We also have as well our technical document library, which goes into even more depth, consisting of guidance papers and codes of practice. There is, of course, a whole library of previous dampness related webinars that you can get your teeth into and certainly listen to. And lastly, there will be a recording of this webinar that anyone that is registered or has attended today, you will automatically get in the next couple of days. Now, if you do really want to take it up to the next level and learn even more, there is a series of training that you can also get involved in, there is our flagship surveyor training, both online and classroom based, that you can jump on board. That's our timber and dampness on buildings. There is as well for tradespeople and technicians training available to you, and as well there's a variety of dampness and condensation training courses that you can look at as well. For those that may be interested, just within the chat, I've just stuck into a link to the training courses, and you can knock yourself out. What's coming up next? Our next webinar, we are switching our focus, and it will be more based on invasive beads, in particular bamboo. Is bamboo as bad as knotweed, or is it worse? Look out for information coming out about that. It will be on the 26th of October. I should have it, the information and the registration link within the replay email that I'll be sending out to all shortly. And if you're watching the replay on this, it will be in the show notes for you. Similar as well, any links that we've talked about over the course of the webinar, they will be within the show notes, either on the YouTube channel or on the PCE webpage. Last but not least, Tony, I just want to say a big thank you to yourself for sharing your knowledge and insights. I think everyone, certainly going by the comments, everyone really appreciated it. And I think there was a lot of lovely kind of tips and guidance that lots of people can take away. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone that joined us this morning. Hopefully, as with the comments, everyone took away something from it and gained some extra knowledge. And lastly, just want to say, hopefully, a good morning to everyone. Hopefully, we see you at the next webinar, and take care and goodbye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.